After finding it at a deep discount, I finally played the remake of Resident Evil 4, and it's about what I thought that it was. So it is a pretty good game, but obviously in many ways it is actually inferior to the original. I think that the best way we can sum this up is that modernity and progress is not necessarily a net positive. Having something new is not necessarily having something better. I think that there's four pillars where the game is essentially lacking, and I'll go by them in order. The first off, I think that it's graphically, this game and a lot of games are actually, in a certain sense, worse looking than the games that came before them. In the case of RE4 Remake, I think that it is a good looking game, but it still has one of the issues that a lot of modern games have. So modern games actually look worse and also have really bad art direction. As you know, a lot of good talent in the industry left a long time ago. Most studios that you know are the same studios, but only by name. Nowadays, it's a lot of diversity hires and not much else. So when you see the name of a game studio, you have to understand that it's a lot of people that weren't necessarily hired for their abilities, and they're essentially using whatever asset is left. And so now you have games that look worse than games that came out 15 or 20 years ago. A good example are water effects in video games. Super Mario Sunshine has way better looking water than whatever slop came out in the past 5 to 10 years. And it all comes down to how it's programmed. A lot of games nowadays, the water doesn't even react to your character walking in it, or the character doesn't react to being in water. In Jak and Daxter, Jak will walk differently when he's in water, and of course, again, the water in Mario Sunshine. The best mental image I can create is, imagine you have Martin Scorsese and he's making a new movie, but he's making a new movie with a $500 camera. Meanwhile, you have a film student that's going to make a new movie, but the film student is making it with a $5,000 camera, despite the fact that the material that the film student has is objectively better. Because of his talent and comprehension of the craft, Martin Scorsese will still have a better looking movie despite the fact that he has worse tools. So a lot of games will lack the ability to be properly programmed to have good graphics that convey information to the players. You're not going to see the shells being ejected out of the guns. You're not going to see splashing effects in the water. The texture of the water is going to be bad. The physics of the water is going to be bad. Games are actually worse looking. Yes, there was a time where new games obviously were better looking. Arkham Knight is a really fantastic looking game, especially with its rain effect. And somehow, despite the fact that it came out in 2015, it has better rain than Resident Evil 4 Remake that came out in 2023. But overall, it's still a good looking game, and that also becomes a disadvantage because now that you have higher graphic fidelity, it's kind of tempting to just start stacking the game with whatever assets and whatever textures that you can. So a lot of the game becomes visually illegible, and that actually affects the gameplay. For example, you have traps in the original, but the traps are easy to see. Bear traps kind of stand out from the rest of the environment because the environment is detailed but not cluttered. It is somewhat barren. But in the remake, it's impossible to see the bear traps. Most I spotted because I've played Resident Evil 4 before and I know to look out for them. But honestly, I still got caught by a couple of them because, again, illegible environments. So what they do is that they put a lot of white rags and yellow paint to mark the environment, and the bear traps, to compensate for that, well, they do barely any damage, if at all, because again, you really can't distinguish a lot of the elements in the game. The art direction is also worse. It's clear that, and you can spot them, that there's a lot of reused assets from Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 8, and the game is a lot more colorful. But games from, let's say, 1999 to 2005 were following a trend. A lot of games that came out in that era were colorful mascot games, so games that came after that were a bit more dark and dreary, but not in a edgy way like a lot of these military shooters that just didn't have any style. No, it was actually in a way where it established a mood, like the gothic mood of Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, and in this case, it was a mixture of Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the Blair Witch Project. Resident Evil 4 looked really good. You had this contrast between the good Boy Scout clean-cut agent Leon Kennedy and this metallic, bloody, grungy game, and that art style was everywhere. It was on the cover, the manual, the promotional art. You really had this feel of late autumn when you think about Resident Evil 4. But now that feeling is gone, and ironically the game is less scary because everything is really bright and overcolored. Well, the game itself is actually really dark and you have to bring up the brightness like a lot of modern games, but when you do bring up the brightness to a reasonable level, you realize that the mood is really lost. My second issue is the shortest and most obvious one. The game lacks a lot of the humor and the tongue-in-cheek feel that the original had. There's a lot of weird moments that were repurposed or completely cut. They throw you a bone now and then, but the moments are just not as good. I think one of the best examples is the bingo sequence in the beginning. Yes, Leon says the line, but he says it in a really drab way, and instead of zooming in on the village and you can kind of see the carnage of what just happened from a bird's eye view, and also take a breather and remove yourself from the scene, you just have the corpse of a police officer in the background, and it just doesn't hit the same. It ironically made a scene that was supposed to have a bit of levity darker than it supposedly was originally. I know it, you know it, your grandmother knows it. They were really trying to repurpose the entire Resident Evil franchise as this really grounded and down-to-earth franchise, which it already was, but there was always a bit of silliness in it. And of course, that silliness got out of control in Code Veronica and Resident Evil 0. Resident Evil 4 went back to this weird tone, but at least when it went back to it, it made sure that they were aware that it was weird. And so, yes, the series was always down to earth, but there was a little bit of place for the more absurd elements of it. For example, Mr. X, his final form, his original design, was clearly something inspired by monster design from 70s and 80s anime. He wouldn't be out of place in something like Guyver. But in the remake, he's just shirtless and kinda missing a portion of his jaw. Is just, well, jarring. What I'm trying to say is that, well, if they could have, I wouldn't be surprised if they would have just removed the zombies and the lickers altogether. And it's kinda contradictory because then you play something like Resident Evil 8 and you have an 8-foot dummy mommy or whatever the fuck kids like nowadays, and you have werewolves for some reason, but then they take the original games and try to really remove and just sand off the edge off of them, and then they reach the game that is silly and that has the most edge and then really try to remove that. But Resident Evil 4 is like a double-edged sword. It is mostly edge, and then you have Point number 3 that kind of leads directly into point number 4 is that there's a lot of unnecessary changes, especially when it comes to level design. And I'm gonna be honest, there are some good changes in Resident Evil 4. For example, the fact that I don't have to go in the attaché case to switch weapons, which is honestly something that should have been implemented in the HD re-release of that game. Well, the 10 re-releases of that game. Honestly, Resident Evil 4 Remake is not necessary. You should have just made an HD re-release with the texture pack that was fan-made and just add that ability and the game would be perfect again. There is this particular segment when you finally get to the church, and when you get to the church, you can't just take the door like you usually would that would lead to the side of the cliff. You have to go through the side of the church and then go through a trap in the ground, which leads you to 2 branching paths, one that lets you unlock the gate from the other side and one that leads you to where that puzzle usually was. Why did we have that? It's not like you have to go through a new section on the ground with enemies. It just leads right outside and you just unlock the gate anyways. What was the point? Why not just open the door straight away? Why did you create this new room, create this new asset, when you could have just have the layout be exactly the same? Yes, there are good changes in Resident Evil 4, but there's also a lot of changes that are just sideways, where it's like, why did you change that? It didn't add anything. In Resident Evil 1 Remake, they added a balcony to the Spencer Mansion. It doesn't change the layout at all. It's just an external balcony, but it's a pretty good shortcut, especially if you want to avoid the hunters later on. So it's actually a pretty good idea. It added without transforming the rest, but here it doesn't add anything, and that's some of the best changes in the game. Ones are just lateral moves where you scratch your head and you think, why? A lot of changes, unfortunately, make the game slightly worse. One of the best examples is just the beginning of the game. Before, you had cutscenes really establishing the tone properly. It seemed cliche, but now that I look upon it, it's cliche but functional. Now, even that they fuck up in the remaster. It's not as poignant as it once was. It kinda stretches out the tension in a way that's improper, and it complicates the scene. It used to be pretty simple. You manage to get to near the town and you go to the lodge, and while you're inside the lodge, well, before that, before getting to the lodge, you're being watched. And then you get to the inside of the lodge, and while you're inside, you hear a lot of noises outside, and that prepares you for the fight you're going to have in the village, because you go inside of a place and then you learn that you can jump out of windows and that people will crowd you when you get inside the place. And then when you get outside, you got this nice open space with 3 ganados, and you shoot them, and there's pressure but not too much because you have space to run around, and then you discover that your guys are dead or kidnapped, and that's the end of that basically. But in the remake, you get this long sets of just narrow paths that lead to a lodge where the only enemy you get to fight is an enemy that's probably way too strong for what you have in the beginning. And unfortunately, Resident Evil 4 adds a lot of lack of response, should I say, to shots. Enemies don't care as much because you're more mobile, but ironically, the way that they behave and move doesn't fit with how Leon moves. He has the moveset from Resident Evil 2 Remake, which is a moveset that is made for slower enemies, and these slow enemies, but are really tanky, are there to compensate for the fact that now you have free aiming and you can move while you shoot, but you have to stand still to get the perfect shots. But now standing still to get perfect shots like the original Resident Evil 4, well, that doesn't work because the enemies don't behave the same. They grab a lot more, they're a lot more aggressive, and they resist the shots. So they broke the balance of that game. So now you get an enemy, a new version of an enemy that's introduced without fanfare, that is just more resilient than the regular enemies. Then you get two enemies that you're better to avoid, and all this was pretty unnecessary. It was a lot more simple when you learn that, well, your guys are outside and something happened, rather than have one guy die in the basement and the other guy get kidnapped. It makes everything more muddy and complicated. And then you finally get to the original path that you found in the original 4, and the dog is not there. But because of course that's too silly, especially when he comes back to save you. The dog is there, but he's introduced much later. So instead of having a dog that proves that you're not a sociopath because you save him, and then when you save him you realize that, oh, okay, you can open traps. When it happens in gameplay, you know what button to use, and it also shows you that there are traps and that people outside of you can get caught in them. And then afterwards you can use these traps, including the dynamite, against the two next Ganados. But in this version there's a dog, but the dog is dead. And then when you get to the trap is closed and there's no dynamite. And the guy that comes up from the right always transform. And now you learn that you can stab people in the neck to stop their transformation. But why introduce such strong enemies right away? Why not keep them for later, especially because it was a nice reveal? Because the first time it happened there was a cutscene and it was raining and it was dark, and now it's just like this for no reason, and it gets, again, no fanfare. It's after saying all of this that I realize how many things that the remake breaks. There is really a lesson to be had here about how you don't try to fix things that are not broken. Originally, the game prepared you for that big fight you were going to have in the house by giving you a smaller house. You start with an enemy that dies in 2 hits, but in the remake he dies in a cutscene. Then you get a nice open space with 3 enemies that have normal resilience. Then you get a little bit of mystery as to what happens to your compatriots, and then you get on a path that A, rewards you for being nice with the dog, and B, also teaches you about traps. And then you get to try it against just 2 enemies before finding a dead woman that kinda amps up the risk that Ashley is in currently, and then fighting another enemy hiding in a cabin, and then finally you get to the village proper and you get all that perfect vertical slice of a first level. The way Resident Evil 4 original was tutorialized was genius, and the changes in this show that A, they have no understanding of the genius of the original, and B, you're shown that they're clearly not as good as developers. I would not mind these changes if the changes led to something equivalent and or better, something to freshen things up, or something to show you that no, we're doing it our way and our way is just as interesting. But now it's just you changed it just to change it, and your way is just not as good, and that's a lot of wasted just time, money, assets. You had a perfect formula, and somehow, for some reason, you needed to change it when it wasn't necessary. And this brings me to my issue. In communism, the first thing that they do is that they destroy everything that's beautiful. The architecture, the music, the art, the humor, everything becomes this mechanical, pro-proletariat, geometrical, just sterile, anti-human aesthetic. And that aesthetic, that mindset has contaminated video games. And one of the problems with that mindset is that the public fools themselves into believing that they like it. But unlike with other domains where people are now rebelling and telling enough is enough, I like beauty, in video games, people are just content with, oh yes, it is modern, therefore it is good. I accept the modernity. I accept the anti-human, sterile architecture. Yes, Resident Evil 4 Remake is modern, but it is modern in the same way that apartments in the Soviet Union were modern. It's really oppressive. It changes a lot of things for no reason. Well, actually, it does change things for a reason. It is the new food of the proletariat. You're going to consume this game. You're not going to ask questions. You're going to give this a 9 or a 10 out of 10. And then you're going to move on to something else and just not care. It's kind of soul crushing to do these video game talks and reviews because for the most part, nothing has a lasting impact nowadays. If I don't pull out a review in under a week, everyone has moved on. And this just shows how actually not really good this is. The fact that a lot of these old games we would talk about for years and years afterwards, it's not unusual to find an essay about original Resident Evil 4 10, 15, 20 years later. And yes, the infrastructure of the internet has a lot of things to do with that. People can now talk about the things that they like, but do you really think that in 10 or 15 years we're going to have analysis about analysis? Do you really think that anyone is going to talk about Resident Evil 4 Remake? And already people are doing analysis of it, but it's more so, well, actually it just wasn't that good, or it was good but there were a lot of issues. And the most honest of us are saying it as it is, that it is a step backwards or it is a step sideways with things that are better and things that are worse, but it's definitely not better than the original.